Hey, I'm Mike Lutes. I'm one of the co-founders of Badger Tenkara. I've been fishing Tenkara for quite a while now. I love it, and I'm happy to talk to you about smallmouth applications of the Tenkara system. The perfect smallmouth stream for me would look an awful lot like a trout stream. I love fishing trout streams. I love smallmouth streams because the good ones are like trout streams, but they have smallmouth in them. So I love that structure. I love the size. You're very familiar, Anthony, with the driftless streams, and a lot of the smallmouth streams we have here are fairly similar in size, maybe a little bit bigger. So they're very manageable for a wading fisher person or for fishing from the bank. So that's kind of my ideal is, gravel bottom, lots of rocks, lots of structure, and not too much canopy. So most of the smallmouth fishing I do is between an hour and an hour and a half from here. Those are where my favorite streams are, the ones that I think have the best structure, that have great access and good fish populations. There are some that are closer to where I live. There's a couple within about a 30 or 35-minute drive. They're a little harder to fish. They may have some good fish in them, but they have more canopy. They're not as fun to wade. They're not as pretty. So to get to the ones I really enjoy, I got to put in about an hour drive or more. I think one of the great things about pursuing smallmouth with Tenkara gear, and I'm going to use Tenkara instead of fixed lined fly fishing. It's just easier to say. I know the difference. The 12 people that are still hung up on that sort of thing can rage about it in the comments. I just don't really care. So the Tenkara rig that I like for smallmouth fishing is generally an 11 to 12 foot rod. And I think the great thing about it is if you look at some of the, lower end or more affordable rods that are maybe a touch heavier and they're a touch stiffer than the higher end, trout rods for Tenkara, those rods are fantastic for smallmouth fishing. So if you want to get into it, it's even less of an outlay of cash. And I don't know that you get much by spending more on a rod for this application. For example, for many years, the rod I used was a SeaQuest Tenkara rod that Matt bought originally when we were still running Badger Tenkara as just sort of a test rod to see what was out there in the affordable rod market. And he gave it to me at one point, and for years it was my go-to Tenkara rod for smallmouth fishing. And I think it's an 11-foot, 12-foot rod. And it was fantastic. It broke last year, and the only reason it broke is I lent it to a noob, and he snagged a tree and broke it trying to get it unsnagged. But it put up with a ton of abuse, handled a ton of fish, and was just wonderful. So an 11 or 12 foot affordable rod, maybe, a little stiffer on the action side is great. That's great for most streams, especially if they're sort of like trout stream size smallmouth streams. If you're fishing bigger waters, I use the old Badger Tenkara Wisco or something like a DRAGONtail Hellbender, or the many other options would be fine. But for smaller streams, I think your standard 11, 12 foot Tenkara rod is perfect. For line, the dialed in line that I like the best is a one weight floating line. And what I have kind of come to the conclusion of is that I don't know why I find these on eBay pretty cheap, but you can order a one weight fly line on eBay and then cut that to length, and that works the best for me. A 0 is fine. A 2 is fine. They're both okay, but for whatever reason, one weight is what I like the most to cast the best, turns over flies. If you want to, use it for other purposes besides smallmouth fishing, it's not too heavy. You can still, nymph fish with it or whatever. So that's the dialed in line for me. Line length, I will typically go the length of the rod, or maybe, somewhere under a foot longer. Again, this is a different application. It's not as much, tight line nymphing that I like to do with trout. So if you have a little extra line, that's not problematic, and it can give you a little more reach on bigger streams. So usually, 12.5, something like that, feet of line. And then I tie a loop in the end, and then I will loop in my tippet. And for tippet, I typically use either 6 or 8 pound test, and it just doesn't really matter, again, smallmouth are not leader shy, so you can get away with using just inexpensive 6 or 8 pound test. And then I will generally use between 4 and 6 feet of that. That gives you a little more reach. And then if you're trying to get, if the fish are deeper and you want to be able to sink a little bit more, I might go more towards the 6 foot end of it. So that's my go-to setup, is about a 12-foot rod, about 12 and a half feet of line, and somewhere between 4 and 6 feet of an inexpensive tippet material. And then, of course, the fly. Type of line, whether it's a weight forward or double taper, it has never seemed to matter very much. I just buy what I find on eBay and cut it to length, and I've never noticed a significant difference between, you know, I think most of them are weight forward, but if I take the head of the line or the midsection of the line, practical application, can't say I've really ever noticed a difference. As far as flies for this application, you know, I think you and I have both talked about in the past how in the early days of Tenkara in the USA, we over-indexed on the simplicity piece of it, right? Like maybe that was marketing, but everybody talked about, oh, how it's such a simple technique. And then we all proceeded to, you know, load up our fly boxes with a whole bunch of unnecessary stuff anyway. What I really like about smallmouth fishing is I probably do 85 or 90% of my fishing with one fly. And that fly is a white weighted woolly bugger. And that will work in almost all applications. And I just don't feel the need to use much else, because they'll go for it. And, you know, all the streams I've fished, that's a productive fly, and I just don't feel the need to put much more thought into it. And you'll talk to some smallmouth anglers and they love using crayfish patterns or whatever, and I've done that and it works, but it just seems like I can order these. They're relatively inexpensive. I don't love tying flies, so I just buy them where I can get them, and it gets the job done. I will say that occasionally on days when it's really bright and the water is really clear, sometimes that doesn't seem like it's the best. So I do usually keep, you know, maybe some olive ones, or maybe, you know, a black woolly bugger. Those seem to be a little better on those really bright and clear days, but I will almost always just start with a white weighted woolly bugger. And then I will also have some poppers on me, because, I mean, who doesn't like catching, you know, smallmouth on poppers? Those are a ton of fun. And so if you can get some of the smaller to medium poppers that you can actually cast with a Tenkara rod, it's fun to mess around with. They won't always take them, but when they do, it's a blast. So as far as strategies, my kind of go-to is, like I said, most of my smallmouth fishing is done with a weighted woolly bugger. And so, you know, a cast to a likely spot. I try to let it sink if the current allows, because it's surprising how many times we'll just take it on the sink. So if you can kind of hold your line so you just get it to sink into a likely spot, that can be very productive. And then if they don't take it on the sink, I just let it drift back towards me. I don't know why, but dead drifting a woolly bugger is pretty effective, pretty reliable. And I generally take an approach, you know, least amount of energy expended possible, least amount of sort of overthinking things possible. So that works, you know, more often than not. And that's the technique I go to. If that's unproductive, then I will try casting, letting it sink, and then twitching it back at variable rates. So generally a slower twitch and then a fast twitch, and just seeing kind of what might turn them on or what they might hit on. The problem being, you know, I get a little spacey when I do that, and then I don't ever remember what exactly I was doing that elicited the strike. But that's generally my strategy, is just let it sink and then let it dead drift. And if that's not been productive in a few likely spots, then I'll try just various twitch patterns to bring it back. And structure-wise, the streams that I fish, you know, the fish will orient in very similar ways. that trout do. So, you know, where you're going to find them in the current breaks and that sort of thing, you'll find them in the same spots in a smallmouth stream. They behave in similar fashion. You know, sometimes I find that brown trout, more so than brook trout in our region, are really bank oriented. They'll really sit tight to the bank. And smallmouth are pretty similar in that oftentimes they will be very uptight to the bank. So casting right to the bank can often be a productive measure as well. If I've ever tried letting it sit on the bottom, I'm going to have to do that, but I've definitely tried to let it sit with the poppers. And that's also like really hard to do. Like you just want to twitch that thing, but if you smack it and let it sit, and sometimes like if I'm going to count to 10 or count to 20, it's amazing. I mean, they'll just hit it on the 18 count or whatever, and kind of shock you or blow your mind that if you have moved it, you might not have gotten that take. So talking a little bit about seasonality of smallmouth fishing, I read an article probably a couple of years ago about guys who fish literally year round for smallmouth in Michigan. It's cold in Michigan, and they fly fish for smallmouth and they catch them. And I imagine it's not great in the winter, but it can be done. Several years ago, I started, kind of became a full convert to using Tenkara gear for smallmouth. And I generally start my smallmouth fishing in April or maybe May. And then usually come May, I do almost all my fishing is smallmouth. And it definitely will kind of pick up. So, you know, the season will kind of gather momentum or gather steam as the water continues to warm up. But I've had some fantastic days in May and June, and I've had days in July where it isn't great. So I generally start pretty seriously thinking about smallmouth fishing in May, and then I will mostly focus on smallmouth through September. And you can still catch them after that, and you can catch them before that, but I think it's just less productive. And those are times that I would generally rather dedicate to trout fishing. But May through the end of September, I'm mostly only trout fishing if I'm with somebody else who wants to trout fish. Otherwise, I'm going out for smallmouth because that's my favorite thing to do. And all of those times can be good. It's not just a peak of summer thing. And there is, you know, you can read a lot about it, and, you know, there's, do you fish pre-spawn? You know, it can be really good. And if you fish right after the spawn, that can be good. I'll be frank, I can't quite dial in these smaller creeks. It predictably, as folks seem to do on the big rivers, seems to be more a reliable pattern on some of the big rivers from what I read. But for the small creeks, I just go. And some days it's great and some days it's not. I have had some success fishing for smallmouth and off-color water, and it can be good. You know, I think in those circumstances, you do need to be more active with your presentations or with your retrievals. That seems to be a little more important in those circumstances. You know, if it's, you know, your classic chocolate milk, no, I really haven't had much success under those settings, but off color can be totally fine. You can have a pretty productive day in those circumstances. Dive into the stream. What am I listening to? Sometimes it's a podcast. I listen to a variety of podcasts, but in the music category, a variety of different things. I maybe over-index on 90s alternative music a bit. That's always a fave. But I listen to a lot of like heavier psychedelic rock music, as long as it doesn't have screaming vocals. I cannot abide screaming vocals. It has to be melodic. So if it's heavy and psychedelic and melodic, I dig it. And then I like a lot of Grateful Dead and jam band type stuff as well. So usually something along those lines.